Sure. Hi, I'm Mike Russell. I lead the legal operations function for the Expedia Group out of Seattle, Washington. I've been there about 4 years and currently in my 20th year of legal operations in general. I've worked in insurance, manufacturing, and even in the law firm space as well. Yeah, I think as we came out of the first financial crisis in the 2008-9 timeframe, I started to see in the corporate legal department much more interest in spend information and how we're actually managing our work, right? So people's workloads, what level of folks are doing the work, how are we staffing it? And then, of course, along with that is how are the law firms staffing the work, and are they diverse in the way they're staffing the work, and what's the cost of these resources and all of that. And I think law firms were reactive at that point. They were doing what the clients asked for, and they weren't proactively coming out and saying, well, here's a scorecard or some data that you might find interesting. Rather, to them, it was just timekeeping, billing, invoicing, the simplest things that they needed to keep the business operational. But once the clients came knocking and said, hey, we need this information, then that's when pricing professionals, legal project management professionals, and of course legal ops started to form and put all that data in one place. Yeah, it's often a mix. Typically, you'll have general counsels, CEOs, CFOs asking questions. So, of course, the first thing you're going to do is get those questions answered. But as you build your pool of data, your data warehouse perhaps, then you start to discover new and interesting ways to present it. And in particular, when you can make it visual, that's when it gets really interesting. And I think as tools like Microsoft Power BI, Tableau, all these data analytics tools came out and gave people for the first time the ability to do their own visualization, to not have to farm it out to some creative person. So that's been a real boon. And that's when you can really see a story starting to come through. So for example, in a heavy litigation type environment, you might see thousands and thousands of new filings, but if you don't break those out by state, jurisdiction, type of filing, then you don't really have a way to cluster them and figure out what they all have in common. And that's a great way to save money, because if you start to see things that are in common, these are low complexity, high volume, let's just get rid of them. It's cheaper to pay a few $100s to settle a case than it ever would be to engage the law firm. But when you see a bad jurisdiction or a troublesome plaintiff's attorney file a case in a jurisdiction that you know is going to be a problem, that's the stuff you want to start to work up. Schedule depositions, start your discovery work. And so focus your resources where it'll be of most benefit. Yeah, I think for a while, the idea of benchmarking legal departments against each other by looking at total legal spend as a percentage of company revenue, that's one of my favorite metrics. It's been around for a long time, but it took several years, I think, for that to click with people as to why that's important. How can it be meaningful across companies that if this company has $90 billion in revenue and this company has $5 million in revenue? There's a huge scale there. But if the scale of the law department, if you're just trying to compare what should it cost to do this kind of work in this kind of industry, then that kind of goes away. And you can use that as a benchmark point. So I think it did take a while for people to understand it. But to me, it was a really interesting metric once it really got out there. So I think anybody that's been through a law firm time and billing or accounting system implementation or an ELM, e-billing implementation on the corporate side will have experienced where you've got all this data that's being migrated or moved between one system or another, and it's that pool of data that there's usually tons of history coming along with it. It can be very dirty data. It came from a prior conversion, and it's not really well linked or organized. But as you start to pick through it, you figure out what's actually going to be useful going forward. So you can build out things like dashboards, scorecards, more visual presentations based on that historical data. But until you start really digging into it, you don't know what you have, and you might find some buried treasure in there. You never know. Yeah, keep it short and simple. I would say that's paramount. Executives don't have a lot of time, and they need to understand what it is you're presenting, why it's important, what does it mean for me, or what's the action I'm being asked. So if it's actionable information, which hopefully it is, then what's the ask? What are you coming with? Are we looking to make a new investment in a new product or technology for the legal department? Are we looking to change our staffing? Is a law firm requesting an increase in billing rate? what's the actual meaning behind it. So that would be number one. And then be very succinct. I'm not a big believer in a lot of text on a slide, but I also don't like, and GCs don't like 15-page decks either. So find the most visual and ideally creative way to present it. These days I find infographic style presentations to be really powerful. If you can take some combination of graphic and a little bit of text and tell the story with it, then I think that'll go over very well. If you're finding that you can't gain traction, then I would call my friends in finance perhaps and ask, well, how do they present information to the CFO and chief accounting officer, and what works well in their experience, and then maybe borrow some of those techniques. Yeah, I think it's important to understand what gets you that data. So if you don't currently have it, but hopefully you know how to get it. If not, then that's your first challenge, is to figure out exactly how you're going to get it. So something like diversity data, where you're dependent on the law firm or the service provider to give you that information, then you have to kind of build a pitch so that they understand why you're collecting this information, what are you going to do with it, why is it important to them, and if something like diversity, then how are you keeping that safe and protected. So building that story takes a little bit of time, but I think I would go back and figure out how am I going to actually get the data, and then immediately launch probably a pilot and do maybe my top 5-10 law firms or service providers, get information from them, be sure it actually does tell the story that the GC has asked for, and then roll it out to the rest of my panel. Yeah, I think, as departments, and this is a very common question that we see across departments of all sizes, once you have multiple people in a department trying to manage multiple matters, projects, and spend, that's the key to legal operations. That's usually the trigger point, and that might be going from one lawyer to 2 or 3 lawyers. It might be going from 5 lawyers to 10 lawyers, so it certainly does depend a little bit on the organization and the overall volume of work. But that said, if people are not using a system or a technology to monitor and track all this information, then you're going to lose track of something. If a spreadsheet, an email, something simply goes awry, then you're liable to have problem, and you're creating risk at that point if you're not properly managing it. So I think it's important for even very small departments. If it's not an internal person or a new hire, then consider partnering. There are many great service providers out there that offer fractional legal operations services as well. And I think that's been a new point of scale just in the last couple of years since the pandemic. People have realized that, maybe I'm never going to have more than 5 people in my legal department, and I need 4 lawyers and a paralegal. Great, then go to a service provider and liaise with somebody who has those skills and can give you the 2/3 of a person or the 0.75 that you need to run a legal operations function, but it's not necessarily an internal hire.